The security forces have gone all in. Putin won't survive this. His days are already numbered. Forecasts for the bunker dweller are extremely bleak. Ukraine is breathing down his neck. There's no point in hiding anymore. A lethal injection has already been administered to the Russian dictator. The bunker man himself didn't expect his head to spin so quickly. His own people are no longer saving him. The throne will eventually end up empty. Putin's last close ally was removed quietly. The Kremlin is still afraid that the truth will surface. The mutiny of the so-called SVO heroes flared up and died down for a reason. Preparations for Day X have already begun. Kiev will earn the right to deliver the final blow to Putin. There's more to come. Watch until the end. Greetings! This is the Ukraine Today channel. I'm Andrei Silakov, and here are the latest events. Clouds are gathering over Putin. In the West, they're speaking more openly about how the Kremlin dictator's end could be very harsh. Failure, a trial, or an even more brutal scenario. Analysts are no longer hiding their predictions. And most importantly, today the dictator is heading toward an inevitable failure. This is discussed in the report.
Putin's days are numbered. If this narrative line persists or worsens, he will likely be overthrown within 3 years.
Ukraine has indeed pushed Putin to the brink and is doing so methodically. One of the most painful points on the path to the collapse of the dictatorial regime has been the situation in occupied Crimea. A fuel shortage is already being felt on the peninsula. The tourist season is effectively under threat, and the Crimean Bridge remains almost the only supply artery. An equally alarming situation is unfolding within the Russian army itself. Russian soldiers are increasingly complaining openly about the command, service conditions, and massive losses. The symbol of this became serviceman Alexander Lunin, who publicly demanded a meeting with Putin, warned of a possible mutiny, and spoke of the catastrophic state of the troops.
Vladimir Vladimirovich, pay attention to this. Invite me to see you. The consequences will be extremely serious if I do not come to the Kremlin soon and speak on a live broadcast right alongside you. If I fail to do this, the army will likely turn its weapons against the Kremlin itself. This situation could escalate quickly if it is not addressed. I'm only delivering a message. That's all from me.
And although the so-called SVO hero is now behind bars, memories of Prigozhin's mutiny still haunt the Kremlin. In parallel, Ukraine continues to methodically strike Russian oil depots, refineries, electrical substations, and military-industrial complex enterprises. Ordinary Russians are already feeling the consequences. Fuel problems are spreading across the country. Talk of a possible new wave of mobilization is growing louder, and discontent within the Russian Federation is only gaining momentum. It is this complex of problems that is pushing the Putin regime toward its most dangerous crisis of the entire war.
The entire barbaric Ukrainian adventure will look like a catastrophe. Putin cannot escape the hounding. The effect is mounting. The clock is starting the countdown to his end. A loss of trust leads to a loss of legitimacy in a despotic regime.
A Western analyst believes that the most dangerous part for Putin is still ahead. One scenario is a struggle between the security forces that the Kremlin itself has been strengthening for years. Civil war is waiting just around the corner. Another option is that the Russian elites themselves will remove Putin. And there are only two scenarios, either a lightning-fast liquidation or a show trial during which all the war's failures and economic collapse will be blamed on the dictator. After the recent mysterious deaths and purges of the Kremlin's top brass, the Russian elite seems increasingly afraid that they might be the next victim.
The fact that such scenarios pose a threat can be seen from the recent mysterious death of Sergei Ivanov, a longtime ally and friend of Putin, on June 26th at the age of 73. Ivanov was also considered his likely successor for years. He was that rare figure at the top of the hierarchy who possessed such power and impunity that he sometimes even dared to criticize the situation. The Kremlin immediately announced his death without giving any reason. Such an incident creates problems for Putin.
And we should not forget about possible riots in provinces such as Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, or Chechnya. And Russia's longtime ally shouldn't be written off the political books either.
If Beijing decides that Putin, as a weakening leader, is an obstacle to its own interests, it could trigger his downfall in various ways, by cutting off military aid or by moving into Siberia.
Putin has found himself in a trap that he created himself. The security forces are starting to play their own games, the elites are getting nervous, and the country is gradually falling apart under the weight of the war and strikes. And most importantly, the scenarios for how events unfold are becoming increasingly harsh. It seems the time when everything could be controlled has already passed. In the Kremlin, they no longer know what to hide first. Putin's inner circle is adding fuel to the fire and speaking louder and louder about ending the war. Russians themselves are no longer preparing for victory but for strikes and life under sirens. Now, that's an unexpected turn of events. In Moscow, it seems they've realized who is to blame for all their troubles. Ukraine, meanwhile, is only gaining momentum, and that is exactly what makes Moscow most nervous. The most interesting part is yet to come. You cannot miss this. In the Kremlin, what Putin fears most is being heard more and more often. Talk of ending the war. And this time, it wasn't an oppositionist, an independent expert, or even a Western politician who spoke about it. The head of Russia's largest bank, Hermann Gref, a longtime member of the president's inner economic circle, has publicly stated the need for the war to end as soon as possible. Gref has effectively admitted what is being whispered more and more often in Moscow.
I do not think there is a person in this country who has any other concerns besides the earliest possible end to the military actions.
And if the head of Sberbank allows himself to make such statements publicly, it may indicate much deeper sentiments within the Russian elites. The reaction to this phrase turned out to be even more telling. The report with the quote vanished from news resources almost immediately, and then just as unexpectedly, it reappeared. It seems that in Moscow, they can't even decide which signals are allowed to be sent to the public and which are not. When a country starts nervously editing the words of one of its most influential officials just minutes after publication, it usually speaks of internal tension. And it seems that this is exactly where the most dangerous trend for a dictator is beginning to take shape. Because when it's not ordinary citizens but people from the inner economic circle of power who start talking about ending the war, it means that dissatisfaction is gradually rising higher and higher. And history has shown more than once, for authoritarian regimes, the hardest times begin not when society gets tired, but when their own inner circle gets tired. But ordinary Russians are also gradually stopping their game of silence. According to Russian search statistics, the query, "When will the special military operation end?" set an absolute record for the entire duration of the war. In just 1 week, Russians searched for the answer to this question more than 137,000 times. And what is especially telling is that this spike coincided with two painful problems for the Kremlin at once: the fuel crisis and a series of large-scale drone attacks across Russian territory. Russians began to feel the war when gas prices rise, when oil depots burn, and when drones increasingly reach Russian regions. Distant events at the front suddenly turn into a very personal problem. And then, instead of searching for news about the latest successes of the army, people start looking for the end date of the war. Other statistics look even more interesting. In Moscow and the Moscow region, the number of queries about bomb shelters has risen sharply. Over the past year and a half, interest in this topic has more than tripled. It seems that stories about a fully protected Russian sky are failing more and more when they clash with reality, and the real leader has become the query for UAVs. During the same period, interest in drones in the capital region grew almost fivefold. And this is perhaps the best illustration of how Russian reality has changed. If drones used to be a topic for military reports, they have now become a part of everyday life for millions of Russians. And it seems that Russians will have to get used to this topic because in Kiev they are already openly talking about the start of a new technological stage of the war. If before such operations were perceived as isolated successes, now they increasingly resemble a systematic campaign based on the new capabilities of Ukrainian unmanned systems. According to Mikhailo Fedorov, it was Ukraine's technological breakthrough that allowed for strikes on military targets and the logistics of the occupiers in Crimea. We are no longer talking just about individual attacks, but about new tools that allow reaching targets at a significant distance and gradually destroying the military infrastructure that supports the Russian presence in the occupied territories. The minister made it clear that Ukraine does not intend to stop at what has been achieved. On the contrary, the capabilities for such operations are growing every day, and new technologies allow for increasingly effective actions. And what is particularly unpleasant for the Kremlin is that we are no longer talking only about occupied Crimea. In fact, Moscow is getting exactly what it tried hardest to avoid. For years, Putin convinced people that the war was necessary for Russia's security. But the longer it continues, the more often Russians search not for news of victory, but for bomb shelter addresses, information about drones, and the answer to the question of when it will all end. The war, which Moscow planned to keep as far as possible from its own population, is gradually returning to Russia itself. And the more often drones appear over Russian cities and new price tags at gas stations, the louder the question sounds that until recently was considered undesirable. When will the special military operation finally end? Russia is indeed beginning to fall apart. And no, not because of external strikes, but under the weight of its own problems. The iron system is bursting at the seams and increasingly resembles the beginning of a large-scale collapse. Russian officials are already openly talking about corruption, the threat of mass protests, and explosive discontent within the country. Is the moment that Moscow feared most finally approaching?
Putin is already one step away from collapse. The smell of crisis in the Kremlin is becoming clearer, and this time it is not the opposition sounding the alarm. Even in the Russian State Duma, it is becoming increasingly difficult to hide the nervousness. Communist Party deputy Vyacheslav Markayev openly accused the Kremlin of corruption and warned that Russia is approaching a powerful social explosion. According to him, the time of illusions is over and the responsibility for possible chaos will lie entirely with the current government. For a system where officials have competed for years in loyalty to Putin, such statements sound like a very alarming signal from within. Even more interesting is that Markayev spoke directly about the risk of mass unrest and effectively admitted that the situation in the country is becoming increasingly unstable. Another deputy, communist Rinat Suleimanov, who previously called for ending the war as soon as possible, joined the criticism. It seems that even in political circles loyal to the Kremlin, people are increasingly starting to ask the uncomfortable question: how much longer can Russia endure this war? Reasons for discontent are piling up one after another. Mass internet outages, the lack of tangible success at the front, economic problems, and regular Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian rear are increasingly affecting the public mood. And while propaganda continues to talk about stability, even representatives of the system itself are starting to speak openly about how dangerous social tension is building up behind the facade of Kremlin confidence. Meanwhile, Kyiv is adding fuel to the fire. Volodymyr Zelensky's publication of intelligence on the internal situation in Russia was a real wake-up call for Putin. The president stated that Ukrainian intelligence obtained documents on the actual internal political situation in Russia, the very reports that land directly on Putin's desk. And despite the tradition of Russian officials sugarcoating reality, the picture emerging there is quite bleak.
We understand that Putin is rarely given completely truthful information without embellishment, but even what he sees in the documents that reach him still allows for certain conclusions to be drawn.
According to intelligence, the level of Russian discontent with Putin continues to grow and shows no signs of stabilizing, even on the eve of the September elections. Moreover, support for the ruling party is gradually declining, creating a rather awkward dilemma for the Kremlin. Either explain to voters why things are getting worse, or once again perform miracles of electoral mathematics. Equally alarming for Moscow is the rise of protest sentiment in the regions. While Russian propaganda talks about national unity, the authorities themselves seem to be carefully calculating where and when the accumulated discontent might boil over. Especially considering that summer is still ahead, with its economic problems, logistics strikes, fuel difficulties, and Ukrainian drone attacks.
We believe that these reports do not yet account for potential events in June, July, and August, which are bound to further impact the situation in Russia.
And this is where it gets most interesting. Ukraine no longer hides its intention to further increase pressure on Russia, militarily, economically, and diplomatically. This means that the most difficult months for the Kremlin may still lie ahead. After all, when the economy weakens, social problems pile up, ratings drop, and drones strike all at once, even the most powerful propaganda starts to fail.
The perfectly justified pressure on Russia for this war will continue and intensify, and not just our pressure. Consequently, by September, Putin will face even worse indicators.
This is a kind of public reminder. While Russian propaganda tries to convince the world of the regime's stability, Ukraine increasingly shows a completely different image of the Kremlin, one that is losing control and forced to constantly put out new fires. The last few months for Moscow have turned into a real losing streak. Fuel problems in a country that for decades took pride in its status as an energy superpower, logistics strikes, attacks on strategic sites, and constant failures in the information war. A rather sarcastic picture is emerging. The Kremlin continues to talk about its strength, but spends more and more time not on the offensive, but on dealing with the consequences of its own problems. Ukraine's main bet now is not only on destroying individual targets, but on maintaining such a pace of strikes and challenges that Russia simply does not have time to adapt to. The longer the economic, budgetary, and social exhaustion continues, the weaker the Kremlin's ability to respond to new strikes becomes. And when the system starts to lag behind events, every new problem automatically generates several more. That is why, on the eve of the Group of Seven summit, the NATO meeting, and a new package of sanctions, Kyiv is actively promoting a simple message for Western partners. Russia no longer looks like a party in control of the situation. On the contrary, more and more signs indicate that the Kremlin's resources are being depleted faster than it can hide it. And as we know, people are much more willing to invest in someone who is capable of winning than in someone who tries to explain their problems with yet another propaganda fairy tale. And the most unpleasant thing for Moscow is that problems are accumulating from several sides at once. A new package of European Union sanctions, increased pressure on the shadow oil fleet, risks to energy revenues, and an increasingly active Ukrainian campaign of long-range strikes. If until recently the Kremlin sold the world the image of an impregnable fortress, today this image increasingly resembles the facade of a building where cracks are visible even from a distance. And it seems that Ukraine's main task now is not to let these cracks heal, but to turn them into a real collapse.
The dictator's fear for his life has intensified to the maximum level. Paranoia is making itself known. The bunker man's world collapsed right before his eyes. Longevity for the bunker man will never be invented. Health problems are literally undermining the dictator. In the end, what will write Putin off? A bouquet of long-standing illnesses or an inner circle that wouldn't mind pushing him into the abyss? Let's watch.
To live forever. It seems his main fear is not NATO, not sanctions, and not even Ukrainian drones. His main enemy is time. And while the Russian economy is suffocating under the weight of the war, the master of the Kremlin himself seems to be waging his own war against old age and death. According to Western media, tens of billions of dollars have already been spent on the longevity project in Russia. Genetic therapy, growing human organs in animals, bioprinting of living tissues, experiments on cell rejuvenation. All this is more like the plot of a science fiction thriller than a state program of a country that is at war and experiencing economic difficulties. One gets the impression that the Kremlin is more concerned with repairing its own ruler than with the future of its own citizens. Particular attention is drawn to the fact that Putin has for years been publicly fascinated by the ideas of almost infinite life. He talks about organ replacement, body rejuvenation, and technologies of the future with such enthusiasm as if he plans to personally test their effectiveness over the next few centuries. And talk of ice baths and cryo chambers only adds a touch of desperate struggle with the inexorable calendar to this image. However, the more the Kremlin talks about victory over aging, the more questions arise. Critics point out there are many loud statements, but far fewer convincing results. Some even suggest that scientists simply tell the Russian leader what he wants to hear. After all, when you're over 70 and don't want to let go of power, the prospect of outsmarting death becomes extremely attractive. The irony is that while Putin seeks a recipe for immortality, his appearance is increasingly the subject of new rumors and discussions. Instead of the image of an eternal ruler, the world more often sees a man desperately trying to prove to nature that its laws don't apply to him. But history has shown time and again, death can be ignored, delayed, or feared. But no one has yet managed to sign a lifelong contract with it. Talk of Putin's health problems has been circulating for many years. He is regularly attributed with various diagnoses, from neurological diseases to oncology. Official Moscow, as usual, categorically denies everything, yet videos and photos repeatedly provide new grounds for discussion. Either Putin grips a table too tightly during a meeting, as if it's the last pillar of stability, or he moves so cautiously as if every step requires approval from a separate Kremlin commission. Putin's latest appearance at the parade in Moscow has sparked a new wave of questions. British journalists noted that the Russian dictator looked noticeably haggard, aged, and unnaturally bloated. Social media immediately exploded with discussions, and users began to wonder if the ceremonial uniform hides the Kremlin leader's increasingly obvious problems. The Daily Mail notes that this time, even a carefully prepared television image couldn't fully mask the changes in the Russian leader's appearance. A man who for years was shown as a symbol of strength and control increasingly gives the impression of a politician burdened by the weight of his own decisions. And the longer the war continues, the harder it is to hide fatigue behind official ceremonies and ceremonial speeches.
A short, frail man bent under the weight of a burden he can no longer lift. Either Putin himself is afraid, or he's being intimidated in this way, fueling fear that leads to paranoia. He looks lonely and isolated inside his security bubble.
A wave of rumors hit the Kremlin after photos of the dictator's hands were leaked online. In the published footage, veins, dry skin, and sharply defined tendons were clearly visible. The internet immediately began to speculate. Experts and commentators once again spoke of possible health problems for the man who has tried to look like an eternal ruler for over a quarter of a century.
There's clearly something wrong with Putin's hands. Besides being elbow-deep in blood, the veins on them are also very noticeably swollen.
But this is far from the first episode. Earlier, footage from Putin's meeting with Trump also sparked heated discussions when users noticed his unsteady gait. On social media, people joked then that the Russian president's legs look like they've wanted to retire long before their owner. From time to time, even more serious assumptions surface. Various leaks and unofficial reports have featured versions of cancer or Parkinson's disease. There is no evidence for these claims, yet the rumors continue to take on a life of their own and regularly return to the information space.
I can confirm that he has been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease, but it is progressing. Putin is regularly given potent drugs and pain-killing injections.
At the same time, other observers urge not to look for sensations where there may be ordinary age-related changes. After decades in power and endless attempts to maintain the image of an eternal leader, even the most carefully constructed picture is beginning to crack. And perhaps this is the main paradox of the whole story. A man who for decades tried to create the image of an omnipotent and irreplaceable ruler today increasingly resembles a man fighting an unequal battle with his age. Billions for longevity experiments, talk of organ replacement, and dreams of an almost infinite life look like an attempt to outplay humanity's oldest rival, time. But while Kremlin scientists search for the recipe for immortality, the calendar continues to relentlessly turn the pages. And it seems that it is this opponent that makes Putin much more nervous than sanctions, NATO, or even Ukrainian drones.
And what do you think about the latest events? Write to me in the comments, give a like, and stay up to date with the main things. More to come.